We are very excited to be here again this year. We were privileged last year to be able to be a part of this wonderful meeting about SATB2, and we are equally excited to be invited back this year to talk about assistive language technologies. And with me today is Amy Goddard, and she is an occupational therapy consultant with the Easter Seals Outreach Program. She is also an assistive technology specialist. She has years of expertise working with various syndromes, children who have traumatic brain injuries, autism, and just a wide range of background. And then with her, to her left is Laura McCammon. Laura is a special educator, and she is one of the special education consultants that we have at Easter Seals. She has a background in public schools, special education. She taught kindergarten for many years, so she has earned her stripes for sure. And collectively, we today want to discuss communication, the value of communication, the importance of communication, how this may relate to the folks that you are working with and your children, and to just see if there's anything that we can throw out there that maybe you haven't seen before, or to remind you of some of the communicative skills that can be enhanced and used through technology. So we'll begin with assistive technology as an umbrella term, and Amy will discuss that.
Can you hear me? Yeah. As Jeff said,
Use this. Just come stand up here.
all right. Assistive technology is an umbrella term that we use in schools quite a bit. It encompasses all aspects of daily living. So we can give students and even give adults with certain disabilities things like a reacher or a magnifier or a bath chair to help self-care go better. Today we're going to talk about communication, which is a huge need for a lot of our children and students with different developmental disabilities. The term that we use is called augmentative and alternative communication. We shorten that to be AAC. So if we say AAC, we're talking about some of these technologies that you see down here today to help our students communicate more independently.
Show of hands. How many of you have a child that uses AAC?
Quite a bit.
Not surprised to see all those hands. And so we'll talk about maybe some things you already know today, and then maybe we will expose you to some of the latest technologies that are available out there.
So we are from the Easter Seals Outreach Program, which is housed at our main campus at Easter Seals. Our primary role is to help students receiving special education services across the state have the most quality and evidence-based programming in their classrooms and in their therapy programs. And part of that is coaching teams on how to serve their students' assistive technology needs and communication needs. So to address that, we use an extended model for communication evaluations. So we go in and take some initial information about the students' needs and come up with some strategies to try with our students, and then coach the school team and therapists on ways to implement them in the classroom and in the home, so we have some good data to help drive a decision making about a more permanent communication solution. So we try and avoid the expert model and encourage families to come to the evaluation process in the schools and help the school teams learn more about how to do the evaluation. We also have a loan program that we operate that's available for free to to any school in Arkansas. We're funded by federal dollars and also state dollars, so that's available to anybody at no cost receiving special education.
Those of you from other states, it's very likely that you have a similar program in your state. It's probably not housed at Easter Seals in your state, although there are other states like Arkansas where that money is provided to Easter Seals to provide this service. But in your state, I know some are not from the United States, but if you are from one of the 50 United States, you likely have a program like this loan program that you can utilize if you haven't already.
And then we also provide training like we're doing today. So we do national trainings, state level and regional trainings, and also some webinars and things to help students.
Amy mentioned our loan program, and these are just a few of the items that we have, and your states would likely have similar items as well. And you can see a variety of low-tech options there to high-tech options and everything in between. Amy mentioned that, that we have self-care items. We also have with communication systems. We have a lot of special ed curriculum. Just a variety of free loan equipment to educators across Arkansas. And again, anyone here from Pennsylvania. Okay, so Patan or Patton, PATTAN.net in your state has a wonderful loan program. If you've not utilized their service, it's also a free loan program just like ours. Other states have as well. I just know the people from Pennsylvania. That's why I mentioned that one. So it's a really excellent program. So when we think about OGCOM and AAC, according to ASHA, the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, we all should consider AAC in these areas, these broad areas. So congenital issues, for instance, ASD, autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, developmental disability, childhood apraxia of speech, genetic syndromes. If we have a child or an adult with that diagnosis, we should consider, at the very minimum, we should consider how technology and AAC might be of benefit to that individual. For those of us who have acquired injuries throughout our lifespan, so a stroke or a cerebral vascular accident or a traumatic brain injury, some neurodegenerative disease, maybe ALS, a disability following a surgery. We have a lot of folks go in for cardiac surgery and they come out with a paralyzed vocal fold, and as a result then maybe need AAC. Or temporary conditions such as intubation. So we need to consider AAC for these areas, both congenital and acquired, but certainly for the purpose of today, we're looking at what are those considerations for SATB2 and associated syndromes. The information as it pertains to communication is increasing with SATB2. These are broad-based areas that I know you're already aware of. There can be mild to severe intellectual disability with SATB2, delayed language development, severe speech problems, particularly associated with that can be a condition called childhood apraxia of speech, where there is a challenge with just the neurologic motor planning or programming of the speech articulators to produce sequential speech sounds in a repeated, efficient way. I often equate it to learning to ride a bicycle. Some of you maybe never learned to ride a bicycle. It took me a while to do that, but I remember the first 25 times I tried, I ended up with, a fall, a bruised knee, a couple of, special scars from that. But planning all those movements, the balancing with the vision, with the moving the pedals in the right way, with the preparing to brake, all of those motor movements that had to occur in overlapping fashion, in sequential fashion, because if you got something out of order, you were likely to fall on that bicycle. I equate that with apraxia of speech. So the brain sends those signals to the articulators to then move those articulators in that overlapping, balanced fashion in order to produce speech. And so often that is a problem for individuals who have childhood apraxia. I do realize that childhood apraxia is associated with SATB2. Dental and oral abnormalities, which were discussed in the previous session, as well as some behavioral issues. And I mention behavioral issues because so often you see behavior as a manifestation of individuals' challenges with communicating. So if you're not able to express your wants and needs, get some more control of your environment through the communication, then we frequently do see behavioral manifestations.
So we wanted to talk about the guiding principle of presuming competence, right? So these are important things to remember as you are part of your student's IEP team, which is the Individualized Education Plan team. Some of you with younger children, when your children go to public school, that's the team where all of the professionals come together and plan and individualize, customize learning and academic programming for your students. And so this concept of presumed competence comes out of inclusive education, but it talks about how we need to really focus on ability rather than a functional or developmental level. And we also need to provide all students a means to communicate. So if your student doesn't have a way, or your child doesn't have a way to communicate, it's important to advocate for that and to talk to your speech pathologist and your child specialist about what can we do to get my child to communicate. That their goals should not only reflect functional skills that your student will need, but also touch on the academics and general education. We think about education as a continuum. Special education isn't a place. It isn't its own program. It's a continuation of the general education spectrum. And so we want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to learn from the general education curriculum. And then also that we don't want to ever predict that someone's not capable of learning a certain skill. We want to speak directly to the child and to the students and not about them, around them to others. And then to remember to use age-appropriate topics and inflection in your voice. Read developmentally and age-appropriate content and books. That's also important. So be respectful. So presumed competence is important.
We often enter school situations, and there are amazing educators out there, but we also encounter an occasional one who does not do just this. They don't presume competence. In fact, it's a continuous discovery of maybe what's wrong as opposed to what can an individual be doing and what are their strengths, and too much of an emphasis on the weaknesses. And so we did want to highlight this because you, as their advocates, are likely facing some of these things, some of you already, and those of you with younger children will likely have to endure some of that and then hopefully advocate for your student. Sure.
To kind of go along with what Jeff said, back this past March, the Supreme Court had a ruling, the Andrew F. case, and basically that case was about a little boy named Andrew. His parents had noticed over the years his IEP did not show a lot of growth. He had the same IEP goals and objectives year after year. They went to the school, filed a complaint, and the school held that they were following law because they were making minimal progress. That's what IDEA said at the time. They just had to make minimal progress. They went through several lower courts. The courts upheld that decision until they finally reached the Supreme Court this past March. And the new ruling is that the IEP should be appropriately ambitious. So your children need ambitious goals. No longer is minimal the status quo. So keep that in mind when you're looking at those IEPs, that you're seeing, goals that are ambitious for your students.
Just by raise of hands, anyone, have you encountered what Laura is mentioning, sort of a minimum expectation? And it's frustrating, right? Because you know that your children can maximize their capabilities. And so we do sort of get on a soapbox about this. And so if you, hopefully you don't mind our soapbox, but it is something we encounter occasionally. So let's talk a little bit more about assistive technology and AAC. There are no prerequisites for AAC, so that is a myth that is floating out there. If if you have heard, oh, they're not ready for AAC yet, then I would like for you to know that that is a myth. There is no prerequisite. However, what I do want to caveat that with is that there are some foundational skills that make individuals more, that make them ready for higher tech systems. So I do want you to realize that I'm not saying that with all children that we jump to a Cadillac or the most elaborate high-tech version of any system, but I do want to emphasize that there are no prerequisites for augmentative alternative communication. I saw someone within 2 minutes of being here, a student using sign language. Non-electronic forms are important. In fact, so much of our communication is nonverbal. So much of our communication is non-speech related. And so we need our individuals who are nonverbal to have non-electronic forms and backups as well. Communication is multimodal, and we need to make sure that in any system that we're recommending or advocating for, that we are thinking about communication partners. And this is sort of an area of AAC research that has really gotten some momentum over the last 5 to 7 years, is really looking at who are the communication partners for anyone who uses AAC. And I have a slide later that will kind of emphasize this, but think about that. If you were to look at the social circles of your child and look at who they most often communicate with, who's available for them to communicate with, it would be interesting to look at that and then decide or look at that data and say, maybe there's some social circles that they're missing out on as a result of their communication impairment, and what can we do about that? If each of us completed sort of that same analysis, would we have more frequent encounters and conversation with our own family, and how many friends do we have? It's likely that we would have a large social network of people that we communicate with. But for AAC users, it is frequently known that their social circles are quite limited and their communication partners are quite few, heavily weighted in the immediate family and heavily weighted in a category for like professional caregivers, therapists, teachers. But the friend category is sometimes limited. So I think it's so valuable that you guys are all here making some creating some networking opportunities, even worldwide, because the world is a lot smaller now due to technology. So you can establish those social networks even living in a different country or state. Voice output supports speech development. We have fought this, at least since I've been in the profession, this myth that if we give someone a speech-generating device, that we are giving up on oral communication, that speech is not going to be something that is a reality for them, and that's not the case. So often we see individuals who use communication devices for many years and then ultimately gain verbal speech well enough to be efficient and use it. But that is certainly a myth that we're giving up on speech when we use voice output supports. So ultimately, and you guys know this from your own experiences, the aim of any system is for individuals to meet communication requirements as intelligibly, specifically, efficiently, independently, in a socially valued manner as possible. And we really want to highlight that socially valued manner. We think that educationally, students need access to communication throughout their entire school day to access their curriculum effectively. They need it throughout their home environment and any other setting that he or she goes to. They need access to their communication system. We frame this as well through the WHO ICF framework, the World Health Organization model. And earlier, our previous presentation did a wonderful job, the previous presenter, talking about SATB2 and the body structure impairment issues that are occurring at the genetic level. For our purpose with communication, we want to really hone in on this participation level. That what is it that communicatively the children that we have and are working with, what are they unable to do that their same age peers are doing communicatively? And how can we address that through technology? But quickly we run into this issue, right? You run into a funding issue in many places. How many of you have had funding concerns as it relates to AAC? How many of you that eventually got AAC funded had lengthy delays with getting AAC funded? Absolutely. So we saw several hands come up with that. Insurance will generally pay for AAC devices, but frequently, Amy and I do evaluations all over the state. We will write 2 to 3, maybe sometimes 4 addendums to get a device funded through private insurance. Some insurances pay more efficiently than others, and some automatically deny. And so we've kind of learned that, and we know that you've encountered that, some of you as well. Private pay is a reality. Some can do that, but these devices are quite expensive. The advent of the iPad has really lowered the cost and provided more options for many individuals. And so we will talk about the iPad in just a little while. We have an iPad fan in the audience, and we're fans as well. And we'll talk about durable medical equipment and maybe the rationale or reasons for why you might choose one durable device over an iPad and why you might choose an iPad over durable medical equipment. So we'll discuss and differentiate that. There's some telecommunications programs in every state. I don't know about if you're international, what that looks like in your country, but certainly that's something to look into from wherever you're from. Waiver programs, grants, loan programs like ours, the Tech Grant, the Tech Act for each state provides a clearinghouse of loan technology for each citizen if you need it in each state. So there are programs that fund that. And various commissions, Arkansas Spinal Cord Commission can help with that, as well as the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and then vendors.
And this might be an area that you all want to take up as, you know, a group of parents and as a grassroots effort, since the Spinal Cord Commission and Muscular Dystrophy, you know, they've come together and they realize that their people need access to equipment. You know, since communication is a primary issue with your children, that might be something that you all choose to focus on as well, trying to find some, you know, avenues and some funding streams for communication devices. All right, so again, just a little bit more terminology from the educational perspective. As you guys, like Jeff mentioned, advocate for your students. Back in 1876, we gave children with special needs access to schools. It's pretty unbelievable that that was ever a need, but that happened a long time ago. It wasn't until 1980 that we gave children with special needs access to classrooms. Some of you probably remember that children with severe disabilities were educated elsewhere in institutions and other places. In 1987, we gave students in special education access to the general education curriculum, and with the revision of the federal law IDEA, we gave students access to instructional materials. There's been a new law that's passed in, I think it was 2015, Every Student Succeeds Act, which is called ESSA. Every state has an ESSA plan. Opened up even more avenues for children receiving special education services, particularly in the area of technology. So, you know, if you're interested in learning more about what your state has said they will do for ESSA, you can find that plan.
Yeah, if you did a comparison of No Child Left Behind and then ESSA, and looked at the number of times that individuals with disabilities are mentioned in general, and that technology associated with individuals with disabilities, how many times that's mentioned in a comparison, it's dramatically more in the ESSA plan. So we are continuing to advance with the topic of the day.
So an assistive technology device is defined in federal law in the United States as anything that helps a student with special needs increase their independence in any area, Whether you make it, with duct tape and PVC, or buy it as an expensive piece of equipment, like an iPad or an eye gaze system, any of those things are considered an assistive technology device.
Yeah, something simple like a pencil grip is an assistive technology device. And like she said, anything you make with duct tape or fashion out of anything that you've got lying around, that's considered assistive technology. So I would imagine that everyone in this room in some form or fashion has crafted some form of AT or assistive technology for either yourself or someone you love.
So assistive technology supports all areas of the school day, including self-care. So grab bars in a bathroom, should your student need that. Handrails by steps. Certainly visual aids, but communication is primary. And in Arkansas, we have a referral unit into our program, and every year, I've been there for 8 years, every year communication is far and away the highest level of referral. And so, communication is a huge need.
And you can see these other areas that communication will have an impact on, for instance, reading and writing. Such a huge overlap between one's ability to read and write and their underlying communicative skills. You guys know this actor? You watch this show, anyone? Speechless. He's such a great champion for just sort of inclusion in media, mainstream media. The show Speechless is on ABC. I heard him talk in Los Angeles last November. He was the keynote speaker at the American Speech and Hearing Association convention. And he is amazing. He actually has verbal speech, but is a severe stutterer. And so on the show, he uses AAC. In real life, he uses AAC as a help with his severe stuttering or disfluency. Amazing young man and actor. So I love that it's finally reaching mainstream entertainment.
Assistive technology is a continuum, so it's anything from, like Jeff said, low-tech pencil grips, or we've got some examples of visuals here, to very high-tech, computers with eye gaze technology, speech recognition, and different things like that. So again, as you all are at your students' IEP team meeting, think about these tools and technologies that are available.
One of the issues that you might encounter, I don't know if this is happening for you in your state, on every IEP there is a question that says, has the school team considered assistive technology? And there are pockets where you will find that is always marked no. And it's really, or does the student need assistive technology? And it'll be marked no, even if the student maybe does need it. And so be mindful of that in your own IEP meetings, to just make sure that they're really focused on that question about assistive technology. Have they effectively considered it, and in what ways have they considered it? And that's a real important way for you to advocate for your child in the area of communication, but also reading, writing, math, self-care, recreation. Can they access the playground just like every other child? So those are real important considerations with assistive technology.
So again, low-tech items would be things that are pretty easy to program, typically don't require a power source, and are typically low cost. Conversely, high-tech are typically expensive and take a lot of customization and programming. But it's important to know, and just like you've probably recognized in your own life, that it takes a variety of things in your environment to help you function. A lot of us, at least me, I've tried to shift over to from a paper calendar to an electronic calendar. But that's not always good for me, and depending on the situation. And so, having access to both is sometimes important.
For those who have children who use high-tech AAC systems, like a talker of some kind, how many of you have had repair issues with the high-tech system? Raise your hand. Right? So it's sometimes even worse than repairs on the car in terms of figuring out, troubleshooting the problem, the length of time that it takes to send it in and get it back, and then what do you do while it's being sent in? They might send you a loaner, they may not. And what are those solutions that you have as a backup plan for when the high-tech system will fail, because it will. And so looking at those mid to low-tech options and always having that in the wheelhouse is important.
So not only does the IEP team have to consider assistive technology device needs for your students, but they also have to consider whether or not your student needs an assistive technology service, which again is defined in federal special education law as anything that the team has to do to help your student get the technology up and running. So if there needs to be an evaluation done, if there's time that needs to be taken to acquire it, to order it, program it is big, and then coordinating it with each individual teacher and therapist and you all as parents. All those things come into play as an assistive technology service. And having looked at hundreds of IEPs, I rarely see students being provided this piece of the IEP process. Sometimes we'll see assistive technology devices built into the programming, but rarely a service. But the service is oftentimes the most important piece because it takes somebody a lot of time to make this work for your kids.
Yeah, we can frequently make great decisions about what to purchase. We can do a wonderful feature match of equipment, and we can get the right technology for the student. But where we tend to see it fall through the cracks is with the implementation piece and getting it implemented across the day for the student. And this right here, this AT service that is part of the law, directly relates to the implementation.
And I was going to add, making sure that that is documented on your child's IEP and having the IEP team create an implementation plan, have a written plan for what the device is. What's the purpose? What is your purpose for whatever the technology is? Who's going to take care of it at school? When is it going to be used? You have to think all those things through. Who's going to be in charge of plugging it in if it needs to be charged? What data are you going to collect, and how are you going to evaluate that? So helping your IEP teams come up with that plan and having that written and then added to that IEP is really important.
This next slide is just again showing in the federal law how assistive technology can be documented. It can be either as just part of their general special education program, it can be part of a related service similar to occupational therapy or physical therapy, or it can be as a supplementary aid and service. So those are things that as you're in the IEP process you might hear. It is also a myth, we hear this sometimes around Arkansas, that the students can't take their technology home. That's actually not true. That's an IEP team decision. So anywhere in the United States, when you guys are developing your plan, if you want to communicate with your child at home about the school day, then the school has a responsibility to let you take that technology home so your student can use it.
I did want to mention, for those of you who are not from the United States, if you want to further examine what the laws are in your country, the Council for Exceptional Children in the U.S. has a global special interest group that looks into special education laws in other countries, and they look at sort of similarities and differences between the special ed law of the U.S. compared to other countries. And so I would direct you, if you have questions about the law and what the law says in your particular country, if you want to come up after our presentation, I can give you that resource on the Council for Exceptional Children, so that then you can research in your own country what that looks like in terms of the legal requirement.
Here again is the law in the United States about considering assistive technology for every student receiving special education services. So consider means to think carefully about something. And the people who make those decisions are your students' IEP team, of which you are a primary and very important member.
Especially as it relates to communication, because you are their primary communication partners. So what your input is into that decision is actually critical. And so hopefully you will find an IEP team who's receptive to your input as it pertains to what communicatively you're hoping to see out of that child, and what you would expect of them throughout the school day. So you are an integral part of that team.
There's also civil rights law that applies in the United States. Some students are served under what's called a 504 plan, which essentially says that we cannot discriminate against anyone for a disability. So like Jeff mentioned, the playground. You know, we've got to provide access for everybody, you know, regardless of their ability level. Students have to have access to school buildings, to bathrooms, to playgrounds, to all their academic space. So if your student doesn't have a learning challenge and qualify for special education services, but still has a physical disability or even something like ADHD, the Section 504 of the Federal Civil Rights Law applies in that case. We talked a little bit about educational necessity funding. It is the responsibility of the school district to provide the device regardless of cost. Oftentimes, our students with communication needs need that device for medical necessity. They need it to communicate with their primary care physician and with their caretakers and nurses about pain, about their physical needs. And so a lot of our kids receive their device funded through health insurance. And so, you know, that's typically the option and the funding stream. But if that's not the case, the school still has an obligation to provide your student with a way to communicate as part of their educational plan.
And it is, in many instances, the school is not necessarily required to offer the most expensive or the most elaborate version. They're supposed to provide a reasonable accommodation, a reasonable piece of technology for the student in order to communicate throughout their day. So quite often you will see some barriers between sometimes the family and the school team because the family wants a certain device and the school team says, well, this particular device meets the needs of the student throughout the school day, and that can be worked through usually very well. There are many frameworks that you can employ and use to really reduce those tensions if they are there between the family and the school team. But if that arises, I do want you to know that the school has to provide what is reasonable, but not necessarily, I use a car analogy all the time, it doesn't have to be the Cadillac or the Porsche.
So in the IEP process, it's important to remember that schools have access to multiple specialists. And so your student might have access to a lot of specialists to help plan their educational programming. But the school also has people employed that can be brought in to help make decisions. The special education teacher has expert knowledge in instructional strategies and ways to accommodate and modify the curriculum so that your student can learn. The OT looks at physical access of the environment, so you know how the fine motor skills, visual motor skills, sensory processing skills all can be modified and enhanced so that the student can participate more independently in their environment. The speech pathologist is an expert in language and communication and also cognition and can contribute valuable strategies in those areas. PT works on gross motor mobility and safety in schools. You as a parent, you know your student's learning style. You know a lot of their preferences and aversions and also their needs at home. And then the student, we advocate for our students to be part of the IEP process because they are experts in their own learning and can provide valuable information. And then there's also a wide variety of specialists that are available to you: audiologists, vision teachers, psychologists, nurses. So there's a lot of people available as part of the IEP process, and it's important to remember that we need to be a collaborative effort. We need to coordinate care rather than practice in our own siloed areas when we're programming for students.
And I realize for some of you who are traveling internationally to us, this may not be the same list of professions that may be serving on your school team, though I would imagine that there is some overlap. I just returned from Africa. I was in Africa 6 weeks and was there just a week ago, actually, and working with school teams there, it looked vastly different than what we have up here on this slide, and the resources were vastly different, and yet we were still faced with the same dilemma about choosing effective communication solutions for individuals who were nonverbal. And so it may look very different for you, but again, I can provide you a resource through the Council for Exceptional Children that you can then utilize for getting more information, finding out what professionals are available to you. So let's think about the continuum of consideration for communication. So often we want to jump to the most elaborate system for individuals. And I do want to just kind of show you that foundationally we have a need for concrete representation. This is sort of a hierarchical representation of communicative considerations for AAC. And by concrete representation, it's an actual object. And does your child know that that object is represented by a vocabulary term of some kind? And do they know that that object is representative of that object? And then if we move on up that hierarchy, you can see the communication system with maybe pictures, symbols, letters, or words. How many of you had a student who used PECS, or Picture Exchange Communication System? Raise your hand. Yeah, it's a very effective, considered more low-tech option for students early on, but the evidence is increasingly growing about how valuable picture exchange communication is for individuals who are nonverbal. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. But then if you move up from just pictures, symbols, letters, you can get into a simple speech generating device, and that could be like a one-step communicator. Laura, would you hold one of those up? Frequently we call them Big Mac switches. You can have a step-by-step communicator or a one-step communicator. They're generally like a button that offers one or maybe 2 or 3 messages to be recorded for a student to access. So that would be a simple speech generating device. And then if you'll hold up the one below that, like the GoTalk that's down there on the table, the next level would be a simple speech generating device with levels. And then you have a speech generating device. You see how it bifurcates there. You have a speech generating device with icon sequencing, which is very elaborate, starting to get more and more challenging. And then speech generating device with dynamic display is over here on this side. Dynamic display means that when you select an icon, it changes to a new page with new icons for the student or the user to then be able to select more vocabulary. An example would be if you're trying to find the word banana, you would have to go to eat. On many of these dynamic displays, you'd have to go to eat and then probably fruits, and then under fruits you would find banana. But all of those pages change on each selection of an icon. That's a dynamic display. A lot of our children early on are not very effective with dynamic displays. And they do better with something that we refer to as static display, or something even lower tech like something like pictures. And then at the highest level, and we're increasingly becoming text-based users, we all text a lot, don't we, on our iPhones. That would be the more challenging system, though hierarchically, a text-based device with speech synthesis. And we do have users who don't like the pictures, they think they're too juvenile, and they only want something that is text-based. But low-tech options, remember, we need an array of options for our students, and pictures, low-tech options are really great. Communication boards, books, cards, and you can serve a variety of language functions through cards. You can talk about various topics, you can help them learn to comment, make choices, and then of course I mentioned the formal communication system, the formal training program that is PECS by Pyramid Education. It actually was authored by an applied behavior specialist and a speech pathologist who is from Arkansas, the PECS program. And again, the empirical basis for PECS is very strong and highly recommended for multiple reasons. One of them is that it actually teaches how to communicate. The literature has shown that when you teach someone to initiate, the value of initiation cannot be understated. So often we end up with AAC users who are prompt dependent, meaning that they require us as a parent or a therapist or a teacher to prompt them in order to get them to express. And we end up with a lot of prompt-dependent AAC users. They only use it when prompted. They're not initiating communication on their own. The PECS program builds initiation into the first phase of the program. It teaches the initiation, and sometimes that can be challenging and take a long time. Other students breeze right through that phase. But it's important that you teach initiation so that you don't end up with prompt-dependent AAC users. And I just think in general as parents and teachers and therapists, we make children prompt-dependent anyway. I look at my own 2 children at home, and I just think how many prompts I've built into their daily life, and it's like they can't wash the dishes, even though the dishes are there and they're piling up and they know that's their job. They still require the prompt of, hey, go wash the dishes, right? So so if you've created prompt-dependent children or have not advocated for to avoid prompt dependency, don't feel guilty about that. We all do it, but it's just something to be mindful of. And sometimes we can back up a little bit and work on fading out those prompts so that we really can encourage that initiation. The other phases of PECS, distance and persistence, picture discrimination, sentence structure, answering questions, and commenting. So often we end up with language users of AAC who live in what we call noun town. They just state nouns all the time. They're labelers. They can go around and say desk, chair, eat. Maybe there's one verb thrown in there, eat. And they can name people's names. But oftentimes we don't teach other communicative functions, and we love nouns. Nouns are great, but we need them to learn other linguistic functions. They need comments. They need socially appropriate comments. They need to be able to answer questions. They need to be able to make choices. And this program does an effective job when implemented with fidelity. So often we have people who say they're using PECS and they're not following the program as it's written, and so then you can't really technically say that they're using PECS if that's the case. I don't have the videos. So you want to talk about midterm?
So we brought a little activity today to show you how low-tech communication could be used with a literacy activity. So this might be for someone in preschool or kindergarten. We've got a board book that's pretty popular called Miss Wishy-Washy.
I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Miss Wishy-Washy.
Raise your hand if you've heard of Miss Wishy-Washy. Anyone? No. Oh, it's a new book for us all.
Well, she was back in the early 90s, really. But Miss Wishy-Washy, this is just how you can have a language-rich environment. So this is kind of a repetitive text. It's got animals in it, and Miss Wishy-Washy is washing. And so we've created kind of a story box experience, a storybook experience box with all the animals that are in this little thing, a little duck and a cow and a pig. And in the story, they go in a tub, and we could label these things, and they get washed, and Miss Wishy-Washy has a little bandana. And then you can also, we have a little mud in here. But then we created, this one doesn't fit the Go Talk, but you could make a little storyboard to go with it. It's got characters, it has setting, it has, you could ask your child questions, they could have some comprehension skills. And then if you had a Go Talk, you could create a board to go in here with the verbal output. And so your child in the classroom could actively participate and have some language-rich communicative activities. So it's important to talk to your teachers about those things. Back when I first started teaching kindergarten in the 90s, this is what we did in the gen ed classroom. And then somehow, through the decades, and reading is extremely important, I get that, but we kind of missed the boat on providing these language-rich experiences. And for our students with disabilities, it's critical to have these experiences. There's one study that talks about in a typical developing child, they read their favorite book throughout life 400 times. You're going to read the same book over and over again, 400 times. But for a child with disabilities, it's less than 40 times. And reading and literacy is so important for all of our students, and we need to make sure that they have the same opportunities and experiences everyone else has.
So if we can move beyond noun town with this, obviously in this book we could label animals and nouns all day long, but you could really come up with lots of other words. You could come up with smelly. The mud would make the animal dirty. All kinds of different words that could be used that would be, rich in language and really move them beyond noun town.
All right, so now we're going to talk about some mid-tech communication options. So we showed you the GoTalk. So these are typically static display systems where the screen doesn't change. So you have one hit and it says either a word, or sometimes we use this for more phrase-based communication, which is great for social experiences. That's cool. I like it. Do it again. Those kinds of activities. There's also something called a cheap talk, which looks really similar to a GoTalk. It's just a little bit more basic. So it offers you 4, 6, or 8 items. So you can keep it very simple as someone's learning to communicate. And then there is a voice output system called a Prox Talker, which is based on the PEX protocol. The pictures have a programmable chip, and whatever you program onto that chip, your student can say as they press the device.
And there is now a PEX Phase 4 Plus app on an iPad. So if you want to use the PEX program and they get into Phase 4 of PEX and you want voice output, then you can use the app instead of maybe needing a Prox Talker.
Some other things are, again, switches. So we love Big Mac switches, and I think Jeff put a link in the presentation to 101 things, which I think are now like 200 things you can do with a Big Mac switch. So in circle time, a lot of teachers call the roll or talk about the weather. They're very easy and simple to program on the fly, so your student can participate and use those in a really functional way. There's also the line of 3 switches in a row. That's called talking. Those are called talking bricks, and we've seen these put around preschool settings in center areas. And so as the student goes into the area, they can press that button and comment to their friends that are in that same center. There's also a 2-button switch, so you can use that for yes and no, or talking about 2 different choices. And then the talk block set is similar to the talking bricks. They're a set of programmable small switches.
And you want to talk about like a switch kit with a...
Sure.
I do want to say, if you Google 101 uses for a Big Mac switch, there are actually more than 101, like she said, but if you Google that document, it'll come right up, and there are some great ideas for that. One that I didn't think about, someone said they wanted their child to be able to say a nightly prayer, and so they recorded the prayer into the Big Mac switch, and they just hit the switch and said their nightly prayer. Or they wanted them to be able to answer the question during circle time at school, and they could program that into the Big Mac switch. But a lot of great ideas if you just Google 101 ideas or ways to use a Big Mac switch. Yeah.
All right, and then we have our high-tech speech generating devices that have, again, that dynamic display. All of them now are either built on a tablet, so an Android tablet is pretty popular with the device manufacturers, or a computer, a Windows-based computer. So the vendors that serve Arkansas, which are the big 3 that serve the United States and actually internationally, is the Prinky Romick Company, which makes an accent device, Saltillo, which makes a Nova Chat, which is this blue device up here. They also make a touch chat device, which is the app deployed on an iPad. They don't fund that in Arkansas, but in other states they do. And then Tobii Dynavox. They used to be 2 different companies, but they merged. And they make a great product with eye gaze integrated, and then they also make several standalone devices. Most states have reps for all 3 vendors, and so I would encourage you to Call the main company, the main vendor, and find who your representative is. They can be a huge asset for you. All three companies have loan programs that you can access. Some insurance companies will pay for that loan process, but the manufacturers the representatives are very trained in the technical aspects of the device, so they can teach you how to program the device, how to customize it. They can help you with troubleshooting. There's tons of learning resources on each of the websites, and so they can be a big asset. Most of the reps are either teachers or speech-language pathologists, so they also have that clinical perspective as well.
I do want to throw out a word of caution, just because it can be a problem, though it's usually not. In Arkansas and in most states, if you're getting one of these funded, you need to have had an evaluation where they've looked at more than one type of device, okay? They need to look at more than one system. And if you're in any situation where the evaluators are evaluating your child and they're not looking at multiple systems, let's say that, I'm going to give the car analogy again. If you go to the car lot, to the Ford dealership, they will not sell you a Chevy, right? They're going to show you all their wonderful Fords, and they're not going to sell you a Chevy. So I say that because you can get wrapped up into a situation where it's more of a vendor-driven evaluation as opposed to really getting a good feature match, looking at all the systems that are available and making sure that that system meets your child's needs. And so while the vendors are wonderful and most have the absolute interest of your child is paramount, I do want you to realize that you can get caught up in a vendor-driven evaluation, and it's rare, but just know that that's a possibility, and just be mindful of that as your child's advocate. So we'll talk about iPads now, right? So how many of you use iPads with your child? Yeah. So it's amazing how quickly iPads have been embraced by our society and internationally as well. In just a short time, we have seen iPad use just skyrocket. And the communication world has embraced that in a way where we see lots of communication apps that are in the App Store, and it can feel overwhelming when you're trying to make those decisions on behalf of your child. So we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons and some of the apps that are available, and how to maybe avoid some pitfalls with iPad use. The cons of an iPad: most kids know what an iPad can do, and they think it's for gaming and movies. And we can control that, and we still work with teachers and parents on guiding the access for the iPad. How many of you know that you can guide the access and control that so that you can keep your child in an app? Yeah, if you don't know that, I'll be glad to show you before we leave today how you can get more control. Teachers need to know that as well if they're using iPads with their students. Some other cons: they can be hard to access and navigate, particularly if there's an upper extremity challenge. If they have fine motor problems, they can be challenging to access and navigate, and it may not be able to integrate all the needs for the user. But there are lots of pros to the iPad. And by the way, just as a disclaimer, we don't get any funding from any of these products that are represented here, nor does Apple pay us to represent iPad in any way, nor the app developers that we're covering. I just need to provide that disclosure. The pros: cost. You can go, we've heard numerous times people say, look, I can go and buy 5 or 6 iPads for the cost of one of those communication devices. Or if I take my child to the beach and he throws that iPad in a behavioral moment, if he throws that into the water, I can go and buy another iPad while I'm at the beach, and from the cloud pull down my child's language system onto the new iPad and have it ready to go again. So there are some true pros to it. It's also very portable, lightweight, it's customizable. Many of the apps are highly customizable. It's very socially acceptable because so many of us are all walking around with these gadgets and it doesn't look any different than anyone else. Apps offer various features, cover multiple needs, and certainly we as adults, because we use them and are more familiar with them, we might find them easier to embrace as well as we try to program the devices. So, what features of an app should you consider? We need to think about the user, obviously, but certainly the programmer who's providing that AT service. You as families are doing that, teachers are doing that, therapists are doing that, and then not to forget those communication partners. Are we opening up, through the opportunities we're providing to the children, ways for them to increase their friend group, increase their number of communication partners? Here are some features to consider for the user. Some will say this matters more than others. You'll find some vendors of apps right now who will say, it doesn't matter the symbols. Symbols don't matter at all. It doesn't matter that the sunshine represents the word like instead of the word sunshine or the word hot, right? So the symbol to some, there's a huge camp that says that doesn't matter at all. There's another camp that argues that point and says the symbols matter to some people. But we factor it in, of course, into our recommendations and our evaluations. Phrases, some people do not need to and don't have the efficiency to program one word at a time. Some can and do it very effectively, and they learn the language function by, building a sentence out one word at a time. Others need the efficiency of phrases or sentences programmed into the system so that they have quick access to something to say to a communication partner. In general, communication partners are not great listeners. They don't give us much time to say what we want to say, so we have to get it out quickly, and if we don't, then we might lose their interest. So it's important that we communicate efficiently. The layout of the language, you need core vocabulary for sure, but then if you're at a restaurant and it's a seafood restaurant, there's lots of vocabulary there that is not core vocabulary. It's like fringe vocabulary. You probably don't use the word shrimp or crab legs every day. But when you're at a seafood restaurant, you need that vocabulary, and that's fringe vocabulary. So you need options for core vocabulary that you would use in multiple settings daily, and then you need access to fringe vocabulary that would be specific to the setting. Some more features for the user. You need a lot of images. You don't want to limit your students to just a few vocabulary words and a few images. You want thousands if possible. You need to be able to search for it. I will say that so often we see device abandonment because parents or school teams cannot find the vocabulary and it's too hard to search for it and they just give up, and then the device ends up collecting dust on a shelf. We also need to make sure that we're not living in Noun Town, that we give them other communicative functions. They need to be able to ask for more. They need to be able to seek affection or persuade others or remind others, self-advocate, play with others, greet, take a lead, describe an item, lots of these functions. And so just want to remind you to look at a variety of ways that we communicate beyond just labeling something or requesting something. For the programmer, many of our children have grown up in the Apple world, and they can program things faster than those of us who did not. Okay, I had an Atari, I had a rotary phone when I was growing up, and my kids will grab this and say, "Dad, oh my gosh, please," and then they fix it, and it's like second nature for them. A lot of our students are the same way, but we definitely need technology that is easy on the programmer if possible. You need to be able to edit and have that customizable for the student. And again, you need some really great features with the sound and voices. One of the apps that Amy will show you is called Proloquo to Go, and it has amazing voices. So I think about children and their ability to participate in a play, in a drama at school. The Proloquo to Go has Yoda voice. You can be angry cowboy if you want to be a mad cowboy for the day. if you want that wonderful Australian accent, you can have an Australian accent for the day. My son went through a phase where he wanted to be British, and he talked with a British accent, and I'm thinking, well, AAC users should have that ability to participate if they want to have a British accent for the day. And so the voicing does matter. Just thinking about ways that you can enhance the enjoyment that they have with communication, and that really motivates them to want to initiate more. Here are those circles that I mentioned with communication partners. We see a lot of our AAC users who have communication partners in circle 1, closest family members. Those are the no matter what relationships. And then they will have number 4 filled, where those are people who are paid to interact, maybe the therapist or paraprofessional in a school. And we do tend to see lacking communication partners with 2 and 3 in AAC users. So let's think about ways that we can enhance that to really build in communication partners for our children. And right now in our state, we're having challenges with getting iPads funded. It's let's just call it that it doesn't happen. I mean, we did get one funded, but it took a year. I know Vermont is funding them. About 10 or 12 other states are funding them. How many of you are in a state where they're funding iPads through Medicaid? Okay, what state are you from? Wisconsin, Washington, Pennsylvania. So I know there are about 10 or 12 other states. One of the drawbacks is, I've heard Medicaid representatives say, yes, well, you can take an iPad to the pawn shop if you don't have your child's best interest in mind, and you can pawn that. Now, the vast majority of families are not going to do that, but unfortunately, we have some parents that would do that. I've heard them say it's not dedicated. It's not a durable medical equipment device. And there are some concerns about the durability with that. But you can, like I said earlier, guide the access on an iPad. You can keep your student in that. You can dedicate it in a way that your student is not on Angry Birds all the time instead of their communication system. ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association, has recommended, if possible, to purchase 2 iPads, one for gaming that has a different colored case than the iPad that's used for the communication system. So if that's financially feasible, that's a good option.
The device manufacturers have taken some advantage of the fact that you can guide the access, and so for the states that are funding iPads, typically how they're sold is they're packaged on an iPad with an app in a case. So we have this case right here, it's called a chat wrap case. And that comes with an iPad with a particular app on it, and that is being sold in guided access as a dedicated speech generating device. And so parents have to pay, I think it's maybe $50 to get the guided access code to turn that off to open up the iPad. But that is the way some of these device manufacturers have gotten them through. So they're called different things. Prinky Romic calls it a Prio, AbleNet sells one called a Freestyle, and then Saltillo sells the Touch Chat Express. These marketed this way are $3,000 to $4,000 a piece. You can do the same thing for less than $1,000. So I still can't quite understand how the funding all works out, but that's the way it is. But they're much cheaper than this device in the middle. This large device is $15,000 with eye gaze. More than what my child will drive as a cost of a car. And then these others are about $7,000 to $8,000. So they're expensive pieces of equipment, especially compared to the iPad. The Call out of Scotland is a great resource. If you Google the Call Scotland, you'll find lots of tools for school and also communication. They frequently update and put out these different wheels of apps. They have some for dyslexia and literacy. They have a really nice one for communication, and they've categorized them by feature and function. So it's a good resource to have. All right, I think we're going to shift over and I'm going to plug in the iPad and we'll look at some of these apps and show you what some of them can do.
while she's doing that, I don't want this to overwhelm you with the number of apps. You don't need to go out and buy all these apps. You know, you need to consider the features of them, look at these, and some of you already have formal language systems that your child is using, but we just want to make sure that we don't overwhelm you. We just want to show you what is available and some considerations that you might want to think about for the child you're working with. Here are some symbol-based static displays. So static display meaning they don't change once you select the item. It stays on that item, okay? So it doesn't move to a dynamic display. And an example of that, and you can get this one for free. It's called Go Talk Lite, and it's a programmable, more mid-tech app that enables you to record digitized or synthesized speech. So the digitized would be your own voice. The synthesized would be it does have a voice that you could use that's already in the system. And then you could take actual photos, and then you could also use they have symbols as well. So if you didn't want to take actual photos, you could use symbols. You can create up to 36 icons on one page if your student can handle that much. And then you can customize it with the size of the icon, the background color, and things like that. So for free, that's a really good option for lots of students. We've suggested that, for instance, if a student is going on a field trip and you want them to take maybe a scavenger hunt of their day on what they see, they could use this app and learn to program it themselves and talk about what all they've seen throughout their day. That's an option for them. If you want to screen a child to just see if they're in the ballpark for AAC use, how well would they do? This would be a good app to download for free. And then there is a cost version of that where you would get pretty much endless pages. You get so many pages of icons that you can use. Another one is Sounding Board. How many of you have heard or used Sounding Board by AbleNet? Okay, so I just happened to use this. I mentioned I was in Africa. We had 2 children over there who were nonverbal. One was 11, never had a voice, was 11 years old. And we downloaded for free Sounding Board from AbleNet. And the great thing about that is because it can record speech, we were able to break through the language barrier and have the family use Tongan to record, and we broke through that language barrier using Sounding Board. So it's a really good free option. It comes with some pre-programmed boards. Some you can see what the symbols look like. You can also use actual photos if you want to take photos on the iPad. The way they make money on this board is you can buy boards. They have a lot of other elaborate boards, and you can purchase more boards. But they do have several preloaded boards. And again, this one is free. All right, so we'll move. Those were a couple of static displays. We'll now move to dynamic displays.
More the speech path losing his voice.
Yeah, speech path is losing his voice here.
Okay. So, like Jeff mentioned, the PEX has a Phase 4 app, which is a really nice, it's a nice app if your student is used to using PEX. You can customize it with pictures from their library and import them onto the page. And so your student would communicate with that by just pulling them down and putting them on a sentence strip, and it would have voice output. So if your student is a good PEX user, then this might be something to try. I will say, having done a lot of AAC evals, I have never been a part of one where the student who was a proficient PEX user was not a good AAC user. Those students that have that foundation in PEX almost always transition to a dynamic display without much issue at all.
Yeah, there's a reason this app is called PEX Phase 4 Plus, because when they've gone through the various early phases of PEX, 1, 2, 3A, and 3B, and they transition to Phase 4, they are well equipped to initiate. They are ready they are able to categorize, and they can discriminate pictures. And in order to be able to effectively use these dynamic display apps, you really need those foundational skills to do so.
The next is Proloquo to Go, which was developed in the Netherlands. It has a tremendous amount of high-quality voices, like Jeff mentioned. You can pick different accents. It has multiple different languages. I feel like they've done a really good job at respecting, just how a student might be feeling a certain day and harnessing that through high-quality voices. It's dynamic display, and it's organized color-coded based on parts of speech. So you can see that the folders are where your categories pop up. So if you go into foods, you can customize this to your student-specific preferences and build that out however it needs to be.
Nuggets.
So Proloquo to Go is one of the more expensive apps, but it's well worth the cost because of what it offers, particularly with the high-quality voices and the ease of programming.
And in our country, it's important to be able to say, I want chicken nuggets if you're a child.
Very true, very true. Let's see. Touch Chat is next. It's a great app that offers different language sort of structures, so you can start very basically and go to pretty complex. This is sort of one of their mid-level examples of how they've built out the vocabulary. Again, you can see it's color-coded based on parts of speech, and on that top row it's organized into different categories.
And that's why it's important that students be able to categorize and discriminate among pictures, because these dynamic display apps require that. But it gives, one of the things on this app that we love is that it's built with some pre-programmed story pages. So some of the more popular children's books like Brown Bear, What Do You See? They have tons of really good options for vocabulary and answering questions within that book already pre-programmed. So that's a neat feature of Touch Chat.
C. Brown Bear.
So it's also nice to as an example, to show teachers and paraprofessionals how you might involve communication in teaching literacy. So these pre-made books are a great example, and the student doesn't have to do a lot of scrolling back to the home page or the main screen. You can see that the pronoun is here and the verb and then the descriptor are all here, so the student doesn't have to do a lot of navigating away, which is really helpful for some of our learners.
Another dynamic app that is popular worldwide is Avaz, A-V-A-Z. It's out of India, and they actually do a very good job. Even though the developer is from India, the English is quite good. They even say Arkansas correctly. They don't say Arkansas. And so this is an example of that dynamic display. Again, you can see the color coding for the parts of speech, and Amy will show you a couple of.
You might also notice that these symbols are similar to the ones that we saw on Touch Chat. Some of the developers have purchased symbol sticks, which is just a symbol set that they're using for AAC. Symbol Sticks is also a curriculum for special education. The Unique Learning System and News to You all use Symbol Sticks. So that's a nice feature for continuity.
And one other app that's really popular in the U.S. is LAMP Words for Life by Prentke Romich. And they have employed a theory of how children learn language through the motor plan. And so they have tried to make the least number of hits, basically, to access the most vocabulary. So that's their theory.
Right. Eat.
You want to talk about the symbols?
Yeah, some of the folks would say that the symbols are a little more ambiguous in this particular app. For instance, I mentioned the example of like earlier. You can see that sun up there is like. And so for students who can't really understand that ambiguity, they might think that only means sun. And so depending upon the child, you really do maybe factor in that symbol set. But in their research, they would claim that that doesn't matter as much as long as you keep that same symbol in the same place and that it means the same thing, that they would eventually learn that means like. And then there are some text-based, oh, you want to do one more? That one is Sonaflex. And this one you can get a free version of Sonaflex. It's through Toby, the Toby Dynavox group. And it, again, is a great option for free if you're just wanting a free option for a student. But in the free version, you can't customize it. But you do get access to a lot of good pictures, and your student would need to be able to scroll and swipe on the iPad in order to be able to use Sonaflex. But it's a good option. Again, the light version is free. And then just real quickly, before we finish up, a couple of text-based apps. If you have a student who reads and they just want the text, but they still also want that good voicing, Proloquo for text, we looked at Proloquo to Go. That was a symbol version. There is a text version that has those great voices factored into them.
How are you?
And it also has phrases, and it learns your frequent phrases. So if you use phrase more often, then it starts to predict based on your usage of words or phrases. So it learns what you like to say more and starts to predict that. And we have some other options. There's one called Verbally, and it's solely text-based. And it just gives you can see that they just tap on the word, and then it also offers some phrases that they can use. And it also learns your most frequently used words and starts to predict those. And just like Siri, it can get it wrong. So the word prediction is not foolproof. And we've all seen those epic fails from Siri, right? When they've tried to predict and it spelled the wrong thing, and you've asked someone to marry you and you didn't intend to. And so that's it in a nutshell. Those are the options that are available to you. There are so many, and we don't have the time to cover them today, but we really want you to come away with there are options for you. Really, AAC is ongoing assessment. It's ongoing, ways to continue getting it incorporated and your child to participate with those. In the last 5 minutes or so, we'll take any questions that you have as it pertains to communication. Yes, ma'am. Would you come up and speak?
Hi. Our son has been using communication device for most all of his elementary school years, and he's now 14. He used the Proloquo from early on, and he's just learning now that the Proloquo text that you're talking about, or ProDetect, whatever, that is going to be phenomenal because all he wants to do is use our phone, and he just wants to text it out, and there is that keyboard alternative, and he just flies through it. I'm just so impressed with how quickly he can communicate his wants, his needs. And one of the things that is quite frustrating, though, with these is that the little communicating voice, even though it is not robotic, it still is not their voice. But when they're sitting in the back and they're constantly pushing, it's like, am I there? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Over and over and over. Mom asking phone, mom asking phone, mom asking phone now. Mom asking phone.
Yeah.
Is there a way on these on the Proloquo that you are aware of? You talked about the access codes. We have that, but is there a way to where the child doesn't just get to keep pushing the button because you're not giving them the phone, where they have to go back and actually type that phrase right back in if they want to say that again?
Sure. Yes, there in the settings you can teach it to ignore multiple hits, so you can change that in the settings. There's probably a tutorial on Proloquo's website, AssistiveWare, so you can teach it to ignore the multiple hits, and then you can also tell the device to go back to the home screen after it's spoken the speech bar, or if you got it to where he says the sentence, puts a period, and it speaks it, that it goes back to the home button and he's got to reload it. So both of those would be good options.
Thank you.
So what you described there is the verbal equivalent of perseverating over and over again, right? So are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there? And so you can minimize that, but we also feel your pain in that as well. So thank you for bringing that to the attention of everyone. And it's exciting that your child has transitioned from Prolo-Quo to Go to Prolo-Quo for text. That's really a lot of progress.
I just want to also add, being an OT, I'm also often asked about handwriting and writing, written production. And think about AAC, because it is a form of writing or typing as a means for your student to produce some written work. And so that's also an option. Most of them come with keyboards and word prediction. Some of our kids type and write with symbols paired with the text. And so Prolo-Quo to Go actually has a great feature with that, and so does Avaz. It actually will, you can email and Facebook, you can access social media from those two, and it'll pair the symbol with the text, which is nice for the communication partner, because they're seeing the symbol and the text together and learning the language as well.
So.
Both of them?
Hi, my daughter's been using TouchCath for about a year.
Great.
And she has two different therapy things that are going on. She has ABA therapy, and then she also has a speech therapist. The speech therapist has been helping us build the main board that she is using regularly, but the ABA therapists have built kind of their own just for an ABA therapy board that is more simplified and is in line with their therapy goals. Our question is, our speech therapist really doesn't like that and thinks that's potentially confusing. Do you have an opinion as to what she seems to actually be responding well in ABA, and it doesn't appear she's learning to use the device well, so we can't tell if it's interfering, but I'm just wondering if you think there could be a problem.
Okay, that is a loaded question. So the question was about the applied behavior analysis approach to really honing in and teaching discretely those parts of the touch chat system. And she's doing, is it a boy or girl? I'm sorry. So she's doing really well because it's very discretely taught and contained. The speech path approach would be more of opening up a broader system and giving her access to more vocabulary and maybe not seeing as rapid of progress with that as opposed to, am I understanding you correctly? So it's important to teach it from both perspectives, but it would be better if the applied behavior person could use the system that is already opened up, because it can be confusing for them to not know where to locate that item when they're not in ABA therapy. So it's important to think about the generalization of speech, which is what we are technically trying to train when they're in those training sessions. You're trying to think about generalization of speech beyond the clinical environment. While we do want verbal behavior, we want number of behavioral utterances, we really want language across context more so in the long run. So a combination of those approaches would be good. My suggestion would be that they team together where the ABA person is using the broader system but still using those discrete methods if possible. But that is a theoretical divide of sorts that can usually be teamed through very effectively, but it is played out with other individuals as well. It's a very good question. Oh, and
I was just going to add a thought on that. You know, we don't recommend for students who are learning AAC to unveil the entire system. I mean, we do approach it somewhat systematically with communication boards and setting up communication opportunities where, you know, there's a lot of choice making and options to create an utterance and a verbalization rather than just handing them an open device. So I think it's a middle. There's some middle ground there, yeah. And the teaching is important. And to generalize it, you really want to create a lot of opportunity throughout the day during play interaction and social interaction. You know, structuring it, teaching it in those moments really promotes the generalization.
And in touch chat, you could hide items but keep them in the same place while they're working on ABA, and then open that up in other contexts. And that would be a way to more discreetly work on it in a very behavioral approach, but then to open it up in speech therapy for more of a cognitive behavioral linguistic approach that would promote generalization.
Hi. My daughter is going to go into 7th grade next year, and she has an iPad with touch chat. And one of the things, a lot of times, especially if she's addressing a group or in a park or something, the volume isn't high enough. Do you guys have any recommendations for like supplementing the volume system so that she could address more loudly sometimes?
Did you say it's on an iPad?
Yes.
Yeah.
One option would be a Bluetooth speaker, or does she have a chat wrap with the touch chat?
This has an external amplification speaker. This has a built-in external speaker separate from the iPad, and so you charge it separately. But it is loud when you have it all the way up. So.
And it's through Silverkite. The company is Silverkite, and they make that chat wrap, and she would not have that issue. You might want to turn it down at some point if she gets that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
My daughter uses LAMP in addition to communication boards and PECs and sign. We're really modality driven, yes. All of them. But our trouble or challenge with LAMP, or specifically her device, is that she prefers fringe words to the core words. So what would you recommend? Like, she'll go to her device non-prompted to watch TV or to eat a cookie. But when we're frustrated or we're having a meltdown and I'm trying to teach her, well, you're mad. You're mad. The last thing she wants to do, obviously, is that. She's communicating through tears versus words. But how do I continue to, like, overlap core words, such as verbs, like you were saying, but not always, like, getting upset with her when she's constantly wanting to just watch TV, which, I mean, she's a kid, so I get it, but how can I help?
So you've got someone who's just an over-fringe user.
Yeah.
Fringe.
Silly, ha, 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 happy
right.
birthday.
And so she's, because of that, not using a lot of communicative functions. So one of the suggestions that I would have is to look at some of the activities that are part of University of North Carolina has a program on core vocabulary. And that program has some lessons built into it to really emphasize core use. And you tack the fringe onto it, but it's a way that they have encouraged the explicit teaching of core vocabulary. And so I would recommend those lessons. Have you seen UNC's work on core vocabulary? They do a lot of work with literacy and AAC, and their target is through core vocabulary.
So is it like just a YouTube channel?
It's actually a website that was funded by the U.S. Department of Education. They got a huge grant to explore and investigate literacy and AAC use, and their methods are core vocabulary methods that they have employed. And so that would be a good way to use the systems that you're using, what she's already had purchased for her, but then to heavily focus on the core use. And it's not easy to do that, especially when they're just wanting to she's motivated by those fringe words. So you've got to find the reinforcer that will also be effective for her to use those core words as well. Is she getting speech therapy?
Yeah, and most of the time at school, they keep her concentration set highly core focused. So they'll even have more go fast because she likes fast. So that's how they're sort of trying to incorporate it. But at home, I'm just trying to get by, So, when she presses happy birthday, I try to honor that, but I'll be like, we're not singing happy birthday, we're eating chicken. You know, so.
So lots of modeling, and modeling, aided language stimulation is what you're doing, and lots of modeling. And you probably can't model enough.
Okay.
Thousands of
But
models.
Am I making her prompt ready or prompt?
Well, you're teaching it.
Okay.
You're teaching as long as she is, you're teaching the sequence and you want her to be able to initiate it. But right now you're having to do, and that method is called aided language stimulation. And it's an effective, evidence-based approach. But the problem is getting the number of models in that is required to really embed that. Because you want to think developmentally, how many models do our children get verbally of those before they effectively use them? And it's hundreds to thousands.
Okay.
So I'm sorry that there's not a better answer, but fight the fight of aided language stimulation. And then I would look up the UNC work on core vocabulary, and you would likely find some good. It's the Center for Literacy, Center for Literacy out of UNC, out of Chapel Hill. And you would find some really good resources that are parent-friendly that you could likely incorporate at home.
Do you do any sabotage at all, blocking?
Oh, her teacher actually
Yeah.
accidentally deleted like a French word, and it made me mad because it was a rookie mistake. I'm like,
We don't nobody,
delete.
right? Nobody
Don't delete
takes
anything.
a word away,
Ever.
right?
So it kind of caused an issue, but I hate to do that. I want to honor that she's telling me happy birthday, but it's inappropriate.
Right. So, so the ABA therapist would capture something called pivotal response training. I don't know if she's had any access to that. Speech Pass would go with more of a play-based approach. The approaches are similar. They're just
Aided language.
referenced differently. But what you do is you target a certain word. So if you're wanting her to add, say, the pronoun onto watch TV, I want to, then you would teach it, you would model it, and then you would, when she went to go access, you would block and wait for her to then access I. So you're teaching her, you're back chaining the utterance essentially. So you might pick 5 words and teach them that way. So you don't let her have access to the TV until she builds out the sentence as you've modeled it. It might take some hand over hand, but anyway, that's called pivotal response training, and you could probably find some of that partnered with AAC. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, but you have my email,
Yeah.
and let's continue to talk. I'll send you that UNC link.